distinguished participants, panelists, good morning, good afternoon to all. Welcome to the Journalist Emeritus Foundation's virtual event today, Power of Press Freedom and Online Media for Human Rights and Democracy, organized on the sidelines of the World Press Freedom Day 2025. I am Cemre, Ulker, Journalist Emeritus Foundation's representative to the United Nations. JWF is an international civil society organization based in New York dedicated to the culture of peace, human rights, and sustainable development. Being affiliated with the UN Department of Global Communications, JWF organizes intellectual forums working on inclusive policy recommendations, generates knowledge on the UN priorities, and leads international programs for the timely and gender-sensitive implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. UNESCO set the theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day as Reporting in the Brave New World, the impact of artificial intelligence on press freedom and the media. And yes, we live in turbulent times where media professionals are leading brave work on the front lines, reporting from pressing circumstances and unfortunately combating many personal threats. Journalists' work is criminalized in an increasing number of countries as they face various forms of judicial harassment, online violence, arbitrary detention, and even deliberate targeting, which costs their lives. As we will soon hear from the expert panelists today, press freedom, media independence, and global citizens' right to express themselves, particularly on online media platforms, are no longer granted. The democratic trajectory is on a steady decline as most of the global population now lives in autocracies, where we observe declining trust in multilateralism, moving towards a multipolar world, and increasing use of hybrid warfare approaches. Despite this latest status quo, we continue to advocate for the protection of journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society members as they are the champions of democratic, peaceful, and thriving societies. Well, all these intersectional topics will be unfolded by outstanding experts today, and we have Washington's top news national security correspondent JJ Green with us to moderate this session. He reports daily on international security, intelligence, foreign policy, terrorism, and cyber developments. Mr. Green provides regular reporting and on-air analysis on breaking security news. He also hosts the weekly podcast Target USA, which examines the threats facing the US, and the weekly broadcast program The Hunt. Recipient of more than 40 national, regional, and local journalism awards for his work, JJ Green traveled to more than 50 countries, investigating, reporting, and analyzing some of the world's top international security stories, including the war in Ukraine. Thank you so much for being with us today. Over to you, JJ.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for this opportunity, distinguished panelist, and certainly I really appreciate JWF, the opportunity that you've extended to me to moderate and lead this very important discussion today about the future of journalism. To start off, I have a few words that I'd like to share, if you will permit me. A long time ago, Albert Einstein said, "Adversity introduces a man to himself." In my opinion, right now, across the United States, there are hundreds of millions of Americans that are getting that introduction right now. Many of them have lost their jobs. A lot of them believe they've lost their future. And many of them have lost their hope. And sadly, some of them have lost their nerve. When you look at what's taken place here in the U.S. in the first 101 days of this latest administration in the U.S., and you see the path that the U.S. government is on, and when you take a look at the trajectory of the greater world, it's clear we're living in a time that none of us have ever seen before. But after 30 years of journalism, traveling to 50-plus countries, meeting people and sitting down with individuals ranging from street sweepers to heads of state, I've learned one very important thing. No matter what happens, the pendulum of life continues to swing, and it will swing back the other way. For the last few months, people in the U.S. have been reminded in ways that most never imagined they'd see that freedom of the press is more than just a dusty old term written into the U.S. Constitution by men who all died more than 200 years ago. One of those men was Benjamin Franklin. He was a polymath. In fact, he was a diplomat, a scientist, a philosopher, an inventor, and yes, Benjamin Franklin was a journalist. And he famously said, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Franklin's wisdom during the Revolutionary War rings true today, facing new and existential threats and challenges. If journalists around the world fail to unite in defense of a free press today, the day may soon come when no freedom at all shall remain to defend. So people often want to turn back the clock, and we see that so often. They want to go back to a time when circumstances of their lives were better for them and perhaps worse for others. And I can say for sure that that is happening in so many places today. But for those in pursuit of that objective, I can absolutely say to you today, I'm 100% sure and can guarantee you, you can reach up and turn those hands on the clock back, but you absolutely cannot turn back the actual real atomical time. What I mean by that is time continues to move forward. So do the circumstances, so does the movement, the inertia that we're seeing during the course of our days and lives. It continues to move forward. And all we have to do to know that is to look at ourselves in the mirror, day to day, month to month, and year to year. Let this remind us that no matter how dark the road looks ahead for journalism right now, dawn is coming. But we as journalists need to think, talk, work, and prepare for that time. So let me be clear. Free speech is not dead. It is under siege across the platform, across the globe, here at home. It is not disappearing, but it is definitely being narrowed, it's being bent and reshaped by forces that fear its power. Authoritarian regimes, silence, with dissent with prison walls, and they're doing it with firewalls as well right now. Democracies, once guardians of expression, now wrestle with polarization. They also wrestle with disinformation and quiet self-censorship. Surveillance watches, laws intimidate, and platforms censor. But still, the voice of truth is out there, struggling to be heard. We have to listen and we have to protect that. Laws may protect the right, but it is up to us here to protect the reality. Because the test here is not whether speech is permitted on paper, it's whether people can feel safe and free to speak in the public square, whether journalists can ask hard questions without fear, whether citizens can challenge power without retaliation, whether every voice, not just the loudest voice or the safest voice, can find room to rise. So today, we gather under the global theme set by UNESCO, Reporting in the Brave New World, the impact of artificial intelligence on press and freedom in the media. In this transformative digital era where AI reshapes now how we tell stories and consume through a truth, our commitment to free expression and democratic values is more critical than ever. Online media has emerged as both refuge and resistance, a platform for marginalized voices, a lifeline for truth. And this comes where traditional journalism is under siege. But with opportunity, now comes new threats: cyber harassment, internet shutdowns, surveillance, and a surge of disinformation. This panel brings together expert voices to explore the challenges and promise of digital platforms in defending press freedom, promoting human rights, and protecting access to information in an age of rising authoritarianism and technological disruption. So let us move forward with urgency, clarity, and solidarity, because freedom of expression is not just a right. It is the foundation of every right. So now let's begin our discussion. And if you'll permit me 1 second, I'll begin these introductions. Please stand by. I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, Kiran, Nazish. She's founding director of the Coalition for Women in Journalism in Canada. She's going to be discussing the combating online harassment and disinformation topic in the age of rising autocracies. Kiran spent 2 decades as a journalist and a foreign correspondent covering Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Mexico, and many other places in a post 9/11 world for the New York Times, the LA Times, NBC, MSNBC, ABC, USA Today, and many others, witnessing the inequality and discrimination women journalists faced in newsrooms around the world. She founded the Coalition for Women in Journalism, and in 2019, she launched the Press Freedom Newsroom to bring awareness to women journalists, in particular, how they are targeted by repressive regimes. This newsroom started monitoring 12 countries, and now within 2 years, it covers violations from 128 countries from around the world. We also have Dr. Marina Nord, co-author of the Democracy Report 2025, V-Dem Institute in Sweden. Her discussion topic is the intersectionality of the global state of democracy, freedom of expression, and media independence. Marina Nord is a postdoctoral fellow at the V-Dem Institute, University of Gothenburg, and a member of the German research network External Democracy Promotion. Her research focuses on explaining autocratization and democratization, he tried, and interplay between economic processes and political transformation. Before joining the V-Dem Institute, she worked on several research projects at the Hertie School and the German Institute for Economic Research, where she became passionate about bridging the gap between academic research and policy domains. And also we have with us Abdullah Bozkurt. He's director of the Nordic Research and Monitoring Network. He's a journalist and Sweden. This is his location as well. His discussion topic, access to information and censorship in undemocratic states. Going to be focusing mostly on Turkey. Investigative journalist, specialist in Turkey, political Islam, radicalism. Abdullah is a Sweden-based investigative journalist, analyst, and author with expertise in intelligence, security, and foreign policy. He currently serves as the editor-in-chief of Nordic Monitor and an investigative news website based in Stockholm. He's also the author of Turkey Interrupted, Derailing Democracy, a book that explores the rapid decline of institutions in his home country, Turkey. So let's first begin our first presenter, Kiran Nazish. Kiran, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, JJ. And I'm so glad to join this powerful conversation. Thank you for all of the other panelists. I look forward to hearing from you. Well, I think it's an important time that we are having this conversation because now we have finally arrived to a point where not only some parts of the world where we see repression spreading, but it is, I think I'm forgetting which organization published this report, but one of the international organizations published a report saying 72% of the world is now under, was it your organization, Marina? Okay, yeah. I mean, so this is where we are at, and I'm joining you from Istanbul. I happen to be here on an advocacy trip. We're meeting some public officials and other, a lot of policymakers and people who want to strengthen the democracy. This is one of the countries where it is close to impossible. Only a decade ago, this is a good reference point to mention that only a decade ago, I was here as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent covering the coup attempt. And the situation was like, there was a purge going on and all the people who work in democratic institutions, including the judiciary, the media, journalists, activists, professors were getting arrested. I think a decade later in the United States, what's happening with it's a different form of purge, but I think what is really happening in the United States is a purge. So we are kind of at that time, and what we are learning is that just like COVID-19, I hope this reference is not too off balance, but I think just like the virus spreads in biologically, the psychological virus has also been spreading in the world, and we are going to, as a species, face very similar challenges. And this could be a moment where we can learn from the parts of the world that have gone through this. Now, coming to the work that we do, obviously, a lot of our work focuses on press freedom. We are largely a press freedom organization focused on gender. And in that, in fact, there was a little outdated, intro, JJ, that I think you were provided by our team. It might be a little outdated. We now cover 145 countries. We monitor 145 countries where we look at the state of press freedom and any kind of press freedom attacks that take place against women and LGBTQ journalists. And in the last 5 years, we recently published a 5-year report. In the last 5 years, we've seen more than 270% rise on attacks against women and LGBTQ journalists across the world. A lot of these attacks are imprisonments, detentions, police violence, legal harassment. I'm sure you're familiar with cases of Daphne Caruana Galizia from Malta, right? Those kind of cases. Alsukur Masheva, a Russian-American journalist who was detained in Russia for the longest of time. We were very actively involved in her case in terms of advocacy and making sure that she was on the list to get swapped when Biden's administration was making those deals. So there's all kinds of repressions that ways where journalists are repressed in different parts of the world. It has to do with the economy of the country. It has to do with resources, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that is very consistent all over the world is use of digital tools. When women journalists are put into prison, there is a greater chance that you would see misinformation, you would see viral attacks, depending on which country we're in. So I'm going to go over a few countries for context of where we have seen the most number of aggressive digital violation. China comes on top. It remains to be one of the most digitally repressive countries globally. And, only I think it was around 15 years ago when they started facial recognition. So the technology and resources in China have always been great. And the regime has always used resources and its wealth towards repression, which means that technological advancement in China has also allowed for a greater repression because of the digital resources they have. They have been using AI technology for a very long time. There is a statement that usually journalists would use called the Great Firewall, which essentially is a term used where China gets to block foreign websites. It gets to block any use of information that it doesn't want to reach to in the country, and also information when it comes to journalists and media. Then we have Iran, which is a very different example in terms of resources. So Iran does not have as many resources in terms of digital technology, but it's able to, you would still see the decline on the internet freedom, particularly when the protests were happening. There was a lot of things that we saw. And the way Iran does it is by blocking everything. They block access to internet servers, they block access to any kind of connection to the internet and communication. So while they don't have technologies where they could block the sites where people can still access the internet or journalists can still communicate with the public, Iran, which is a less resource country, would block in other means by blocking the entire internet. Then we have Myanmar. I mean, there's some countries on our list that are kind of on the top of the list. You wouldn't think they would be, but they are. Myanmar is one of them. Since the military coup, there has been a drastic erosion of digital rights in Myanmar. There has been, when journalists are arrested, when journalists have been taken away, there have been times where women journalists have been detained and abducted in the middle of the night. And due to the lack of digital connection, it has taken much longer for us to even find out those incidents have happened, which is a new kind of I would say technology that Myanmar has introduced, where you would not be able to tell if a journalist is arrested or not, kind of like something you would experience in a country like Afghanistan, only in much less numbers. Russia obviously is on number 4 on our list as a country that has been using digital technology for a very long time. But one unique thing Russia often does is spread disinformation. It has expertise in that. Not only that Russia does that within Russia, it also targets journalists overseas by using misinformation, by using digital tools for transnational repression and repressing a lot of Russian journalists who live in exile, or Ukrainian journalists, or even European journalists who are reporting on Russia get targeted. There are hacking attempts. Our team has been targeted many times by Russian hackers. So this is something that is consistent and organized. And then we have countries like North Korea, Turkmenistan, which is a very small country. It's an isolated country, but I think it's a unique example of when you would see a rise of a government that is rather anti-democratic or not a healthy democracy. You would see the use of digital technology in the last 2 decades. It has risen exponentially, and you would see an introduction of new tools and improvisation of how digital repression can be used in different parts of the world, depending on the resources of that country. Now, we do have some, obviously we are an advocacy organization, so there are different things that we do to support journalists when they're facing such attacks. Of course, apart from one-on-one support and trainings and things like that, there are a few recommendations that we would like to make. For example, we think that right now, and in this moment in the 21st century, it's absolutely important. The number one priority should be that we establish a global Digital Freedom Alliance, where international civil society organizations, as well as governments and policymakers, can work together. We would love for this kind of coalition. We are working on something that would involve UN, G7, nations that care about democracy and want to maintain their democratic status. It is absolutely essential that we can create a coalition and work together. The second most important is, obviously, it's fundamental for us to support the exiled journalists who are from all over the world, who are now in exile because of repressions in different democracies and living overseas. I think we have learned in the last 5 years that the protections for exiled journalists are declining. In Western countries, Europe is not prepared for that. The United States has been very rarely prepared, unless it's something like Iran or Russia. US does not necessarily, even before Trump got elected, there was very little protection that was provided. In Canada, we're trying to work on that. So providing protection to exiled journalists from digital repression means you're keeping them safe, you're allowing them to do the work, but also making sure that these countries are not emboldened enough to target journalists in these countries, because in Western countries, for example, a lot of European journalists are targeted by Russia or China if they're reporting on those things. So these kind of protections are super important, and paying attention to the well-being and security of exiled journalists is super important. Investing in the circumvention of technology is another thing that we recommend that should be important. I think some governments, including G7 countries, European Union, etc., can invest in these technologies so that we can create more security for journalists and other people. I mean, journalists are one category. I think political dissidents, activists, professors, and advocates are also being targeted with the same technology. So it's important that we can, create resources for people who are targeted by these technologies. There's a number of other recommendations that we have, and we don't have enough time to share that. But I would say that educating and equipping journalists and activists and government officials, democratic institutions who still want to have democracy, for them to work with journalists and those who are working, in different pillars of democracy, media being one of them, is absolutely essential. Repression is not a unique regional problem anymore. It's a global problem. And I think we need to collectively work, not, barred by borders, but essentially connected with the goal that we can counter the repression that is going on globally. Thank you.
All right, Kiran, thank you so much. That is very, very fascinating. One of the things we're going to ask you about this later is you talked about being hacked and attacked. I'm going to ask you about this later, but I'm very interested in how much time you have to spend defending and against these attacks and how that impacts your work, your ability to do your outreach. But we'll get back to that shortly. But I want to move on to Dr. Marina Nord, and she's the co-author of the Democracy Report 2025, V-Dem Institute in Sweden. Dr. Nord, thank you, and please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Can you see the screen? Everything is good.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present. As a researcher, I will talk about facts. I come from the V-Dem Institute, and we produce the largest data set on democracy in the world. And some facts from our recent report, Democracy Report 2025. So fact number one, democracy in the world for the average person is back to 1985. This is in terms how many people in the world enjoy democratic rights and freedom now. Just to put things into perspective, 1985 is the year when Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union. So it was way before the Cold War, World War ended. And again, just to put things into perspective, 20 years ago, it was 49% that lived under autocratic regimes. And in 2024, this is 72%. Fact number two, dictatorships are on the rise. So those ones are the worst types of regimes in the world. And you can see this is what was happening with democracy during the last 50 years, the graph shows, and then this red line shows you closed autocracies. And they were, 50 years ago, they were the most common type regime in the world, and they were declining for many, many decades. And then during the last decade, they're again on the rise, and they're increasing in numbers very rapidly. There are already more closed autocracies than liberal democracies in the world. And you see 35. And during the last year alone, we had several closed autocracies joining the line. And we have now, for the first time in the 21st century, also one closed autocracy in Europe, which is Belarus. For many years, it was electoral autocracy, but the situation was getting worse and worse and worse. And now it no longer qualifies even as an electoral autocracy. It's a closed autocracy now. So you see now that we have more, for the first time again in the 21st century, we have more autocracies than democracies in the world. 91 autocracies and 88 democracies in total. And it's not only that the number of closed autocracies are rising, it's also that the liberal democracies are becoming electoral democracies. That means the quality of democracies is declining. Another fact, this is something that has been going on for at least 25 years. So you see, again, the graph that shows you how many countries were democratizing and autocratizing during the last 50 years. And then 30 years ago, in 1993, we had 71 countries at the same time that were democratizing. That was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 71% at the same time. This was the time when Frank Fukuyama wrote The End of History. And then only several years after that, by the beginning of the 21st century, the number of autocratizing countries, the ones where the situation with democracy becomes worse, they started to rise in numbers. And by 2024, we have 45 countries that are autocratizing. The maximum was several years ago, it was 48, which is again, just to put things into perspective, it's a quarter of the world that is where the situation with democracy is getting worse. And in terms of population, it's 38% of the world population now living in countries and autocratizing countries. And 20 years ago, it was only 7% and 12 countries. So this is something that has been going on for at least 25 years, and this is why we call this year's report 25 Years of Autocratization. The second thing is, the second part of the title, as you can see, Democracy Trumped. It has been going already for 25 years, and now we have Trump. And there are so far no signs of crescent, so we cannot even say that we have reached the maximum on this graph. Another fact, this is a global trend. And you see on the map, shades of red shows that the situation with democracy is getting worse. Shades of blue means it's getting better. And the purpose of showing this graph is that you can see that it's happening all over the world. So it's not that some region of the world is affected or some specific thing. So it's a global trend. And again, I need to put here always an emphasis, the data that we use here goes only until December 2024. So the United States is still not included. Everything that has been going on in the United States during the last 3-4 months, it's not included in the data set. So again, what's happening? Another fact, what we see is an alarming loss of freedom of expression. You now see the situation in 2014, it's 10 years ago, and how you should read this graph, if you're above the line, it means that more countries were improving in terms of different aspects of democracy than declining. And you see that already 10 years ago, freedom of expression were declining in more countries than it was improving, 12 compared to 10. And now if you look to 2024, almost all of them are down below the line. It means the situation is getting worse in more countries than it is getting better. And the worst affecting is freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is now declining in 44 countries as of 2024. And during the last year alone, 9 countries joined this list. In 2023, there were only 35 countries where the situation was getting worse. Now it's 44. Again, a quarter of the world population, a quarter of countries in the world, compared to a year that was already relatively bad, where the situation with freedom of expression was already not good. Now, if you look into components, and here you see the top 20 indicators that are declining during the last decade out of more than 600. And again, the most prominent one is that here you see 9 out of top 20 are different aspects of freedom of expression. The most affected aspect of democracy is government censorship efforts, so attempts to censor media freedom. It's now declining in 44 countries, again during the last decade alone, so compared to countries, compared to 2014. The second most affected, freedom of academic and cultural expression. So it's attacks on university, attacks on researchers and organizations like ours who are doing research into different aspects of democracy. Harassment of journalists, again, you see that it's declining in 33 countries in the world. And media bias, freedom of discussion, different media self-censorship. Another fact, disinformation and polarization are on the rise. This is something that has already been mentioned by JJ, but here again some measurements of what has been happening during the last decade, and you see this is just the mean changes. So if when government disinformation goes up, we see that political polarization also goes up and countries start to autocratize. And the opposite, when disinformation goes down, political polarization goes down and countries are democratizing. These are the averages during the last decade. Here is another graph that shows what has been happening during the last decade in different countries. On the left-hand side, you see what has been happening with government disinformation, 2014 compared to 2024. On the right-hand side, political polarization. Again, if you're above the line, that means the situation is getting worse. So more disinformation and more polarization compared to what was 10 years ago. And two things that you need to keep in mind when looking at this graph. First, with disinformation, almost half of all autocratizing countries are spreading disinformation, increasingly spreading disinformation. They are the ones that are colored red. And then the second thing, if you see on the right-hand side with political polarization, it's roughly half of all countries that are there that are democracies. Now, out of 29 countries that are declining, there are 14 liberal democracies where political polarization are on the rise. And if you are in the upper quarter of this graph, that means that polarization has reached toxic levels. Toxic levels means that you start to talk about your political opponents as your enemies, enemies of who we are, enemies of our way of living, of our way of doing things, enemies that needs to be attacked. And you see that in this graph already among those countries where polarization has reached toxic levels, we see the United States and also France. There are two countries among liberal democracies where it is already at very, very dangerous levels. You see that disinformation, polarization, full autocratization. Here is the example of three top autocratizing countries of the last decade, how it has been happening with Hungary, Nicaragua, and Serbia. Government disinformation goes up, political parties' hate speech goes up, political polarization goes up, and liberal democracy index goes down. So it's a very clear indication that those things are related, that attacks on rise in disinformation is one of the ways how you attack democracy. And then finally this about the relationship between media freedom, democracy, and security. This is from the report that we did for OSCE last year. It's available on the OSCE website for those who are interested. And again, just several facts about how those things are related. First one is that there is no democracy without media freedom. And you see it very clearly with the correlation. Blue dots means that those countries are democratic, red dots are autocratic, and lower freedom of expression. And the media, the lower the democracy index. It's almost impossible to be a democracy without media freedom of expression and freedom of the media. Again, correlation during the last 125 years, you see the correlation is again 0.9, so it's very high. So it's almost, again, impossible to be a democracy without media freedom. Another thing is that we looked at how media freedom and democracy are vital for security in terms of international peace, domestic peace, and freedom from state repression. And again, it's very clear. We looked at that from the research perspective, so we summarized all the research findings. And one of the things that we know from the research is that democracies do not fight wars with each other. This is almost an iron law in international relations. There are very few iron laws in social science. We usually talk about probability, but this is one of those very few things that we can speak with almost 100% probability. Democracies do not fight wars with each other. Democracies are also least prone to domestic violent conflicts, so no civil wars we tend to deal with, as democracy, with all conflicts in a peaceful ways. And here you see the graph that shows how the probability of an armed conflict is related to the level of democracy. So the higher the level of democracy you have, the lower the probability of a violent conflict. And just to again visualize it, here this is something that was happening with Russia. Again, you see this is Russia in 1995 compared to 2021, a year before the war in Ukraine started. And you see the probability with a low level of democracy, the probability of a violent conflict almost immediately risen. So we know it's almost for sure that had Russia stayed as democratic as it was in 1995, it would have not invaded Ukraine. It's almost, from the research perspective, almost a given fact. Yeah, I stop here. Thank you, and I hope we will have a chance to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. That's some fascinating information, as was what we heard from Kiran. So I am really excited, Abdullah, to hear what you have to say to continue this trend. Before we get there, I want to acknowledge a comment that we got here from one of our attendees, and there are a lot of people attending today. There's close to 100 people. One of them is from Tinatin Divalishvili. Let me make sure I got this name correct. Tinatin Divalishvili. And she says, this person says, in Georgia, the online media outlet's founder, Mizia Amaglobele, is in prison. The government adopted several laws against free press and free expression starting on June 1st. All organizations receiving funds from international organizations must register as agents. Otherwise, they will be fined and their representatives imprisoned. So apparently, Mizia is one of these folks that has been imprisoned because of this very unfair and very, very difficult decision by this government to do this. It's very clear. It's a part of the reason why we're here today, not just to talk about these things, but after we're done, we've got to put action behind it to fight these kinds of developments. Next, we have Abdullah Bozkurt, Director of Nordic Research and Monitoring Network in Sweden. Abdullah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, JJ. Well, I'm originally from Turkey, although based in Sweden right now. Turkey, a country where being a journalist often treated as a criminal figures. When you ask uncomfortable questions to the authorities, you can easily land in the prison. Independent newspapers have been shut down, journalists have been arrested, harassed, and forced into exile. Anti-terror laws are routinely abused to target those who speak truth to power, and the simple act of reporting facts has become an act of crime in Turkey. This is the reason I was actually forced to flee, settle in Sweden, not because I wanted to leave my homeland, but because staying would have meant choosing between imprisonment, self-censorship, or complicity. For me, there was no real choice. I could either compromise my integrity and become part of the propaganda machine in Turkey, or go into exile and continue my work at great personal and professional cost. I chose exile naturally because I believe journalism must serve the public interest, not the power. So for the past 9 years, I've been living in Sweden, a country that offers safety and values press freedom. But make no mistake, exile is not a freedom, it's a survival for me and for many of my colleagues. Knowing that, covering a country like Turkey from the distance, for example, is proving to be quite challenging for me and others. I have had to reinvent how to work, of course, especially with the digital tools that we have available for us. I think that's quite a valuable tools in the journalists, gadgets. So we can cut across the wall of the state censorship, although there are growing challenges on the digital platforms, as well as some of the panelists before me mentioned. So we're going to perhaps talk about that more in the future. But in Turkey, the government has demanded removal of the content from the social media platforms. In some cases, those digital tech companies caved in to the pressure from the Turkish government. My social media account, for example, has been blocked in Turkey. My news website, NordicMonitor.com, is not accessible from Turkey. So there are a lot of ways and the means authoritarian governments like Turkey can use at their disposal to restrict access to the content. So there are advantages and disadvantages as well. But in exile, the challenges are not only digital. We face relentless efforts to silence us in other ways too. Cyber attacks, phishing attempts, and digital surveillance have become part of the daily life. I have seen colleagues targeted with smear campaigns, accused of being, terrorists, foreign agents, spies working for the foreign intelligence agencies. And these are not just labels, by the way. I mean, they can lead to serious consequences, not only criminal prosecution and harassment, but also it may engulf your extended family members or even close family members if they are still living in Turkey. In some cases, we have seen, the spouses and even the children of the journalists who live in exile, they were detained by the government just to put a pressure on the journalists who live in exile and still trying to cover from the distance. So, I mean, that's the case we are facing. Institutions have been just hollowed out and the dissent is criminalized. And the role of independent journalism in this, conjecture becomes quite vital. Financial sustainability is obviously one of the biggest challenges we face in exile. We lose access to the traditional source of support, so we have to turn to other means on the digital platforms, raise the funding in the diaspora groups, turn to some of the international NGOs for support, and it's not easy to get that all the time. So that's why I think the partnership are so important. Collaboration with the press freedom organizations, NGOs, diaspora networks provide not only practical support for us, but also moral solidarity. Events like this one, for example, organized by the Journalists and the Writers Foundation, bringing different people together on a digital platform, is quite valuable. It provides a moral encouragement. It gives us much more needed fuel to keep going and doing our job in the journalism professions. But we also create a memory. I mean, as the academic colleague from Gothenburg explained very clearly, there is a trend. JJ mentioned that in the introduction as well. It goes down now, but it's going to come up again. So it's a cycle. So as a journalist right now, in this low conjuncture, we create a history, we create a memory. So we can hold those who actually inflicted a damage to the fundamental freedoms like a press freedom, hold accountable in the future based on the content we create today. So we build an archive, we build a memory today. But to those who ask, what can we do? I say this, I mean, support the independent journalism, follow our work, share it, fund it if you can. Hold social media platforms accountable for protecting press freedom because they cave in under the pressure from the authoritarian government. And speak up when you see injustice, whether that is in Turkey or anywhere else in the world, because silence is, I think, is a form of complicity. So my fellow journalists and the colleagues in exile and in danger, your work is quite valuable. We need you more than ever. So we keep you, telling the truth, expose the facts, because a lot of disinformation, a lot of misinformation, a lot of half-truths are disseminated, not only through traditional media, but also digital media. And that's quite a danger. So on that note, I will stop. Perhaps we can entertain the question in later on. Thank you.
Yes, Abdullah, thank you. That was a very moving representation from you. Thank you. Hearing how the persecution actually trickles down and courses through the population is a very difficult thing to hear, but it's something that we need to hear. We need to understand it, and we need to know that hearing it is not just all we do today. We really need to do something, and we're going to dig a little deeper into how to do that shortly. I do want to share with you, though, while I have this moment before we go to our first question, which will be to Kiran, that there are 20 countries represented here today. And I'm going to go ahead and name them: Liberia, Kenya, Ireland, Georgia, Bosnia, the U.S., Congo, Nigeria, Rwanda, Brazil, Ghana, Zimbabwe, India, Malawi, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Nepal, Mexico, Spain, Angola. And if I didn't mention you and you're from someplace, let us know. This is absolutely the reason why this was done, so that all of you can take the word back to your communities that JWF is out there and these journalists are showing you the way. Kiran, I know you have to go, so I want to ask you two questions. One, a sort of a personal business question, but then a general question about the business. But you said earlier, you're talking about being attacked, your organization, hacks, etc. How much time have you had to spend defending yourself so you can do your work? Just to give us a sense of this is a real problem. There are actually organizations out there fighting you to stop you. So give us a sense of how much time you have to spend fighting.
JJ, that is such a good question. I mean, I wish we could calculate the time, but what we realized very early on, that's a question that a lot of times you don't hear, because a lot of times when press freedom, civil society organizations are doing the work and they get targeted, we don't realize that actually there's a whole resource system, there's a whole time calculation, there's a lot of labor and resources, monetary resources that go into protection, but also labor that goes into protection. Then working on, with our staff, getting, mental health support and all of those things. There's a lot of things that go into doing this work. And I would say that we learned this quite early on, because we started working in 2019. And right after, there was like back to back a lot of things, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, then COVID happened, Afghanistan, Iran, Ukraine, Gaza. There has been global challenges that have really caused us to be at the center of different kinds of attacks. We've been attacked by the white supremacist groups in America. We've been targeted by, Taliban in Afghanistan, in Turkey. I mean, Erdogan's office knows my name. I've gotten calls, so I think that this work kind of puts you at the center, and we don't even know. I mean, I think hundreds of hours a year, right? Because it takes up a lot of resources. It happens suddenly, and then you have to respond. And in every country, depending on what we are covering and what we're doing, different kinds of targeting involves different kind of resources that need. And one thing that we learned pretty quickly was that we don't necessarily globally have lawyers and legal support oftentimes that can respond to the new kind of challenges that we face. Oftentimes we are globally, internationally, in the Western countries too, we're not really prepared for the kind of legal support, because the democracies themselves are under so much threat. Then there's this international barrier that you get, like you can't really necessarily work across border unless it's an international case, etc. So there's a lot of complications that happen with digital targeting. There's a different kind of complications that happens with legal targeting. And then there's a lot of different kinds of challenges that happen with corporate, when corporations target you. So you have to be very prepared, and you have to be very well resourced as an organization. Our team has gone through a lot. We have had team members whose houses have been raided. Equipments have been targeted, and confiscated. We have at one point needed cameras outside of, an individual's house because they were getting targeted and the local police would not help. And this is a Western country. It actually happened in Canada. So I don't think that we are generally, as always going to be as equipped, which is why I think this is a time for us to think globally, for stakeholders to work together, for governments, for G7 countries, as I mentioned. I think we need to pool in some resources to bolster civil society organizations that are doing the work, for research organizations that are doing the work, so that we can do this safely and with better resources. And by the way, I'm good with the time. I still have about 30 minutes. So
All right. Well, in that case, then I will move to our other panelists for the second question, and you can jump in if you like. And I'm glad you still have more time with us, because this is quite impressive what you're sharing, and super important. I'd like to go to you, Dr. Nord, and of course, Abdullah as well. What specific tactics can be utilized to prevent the blocking of internet access, shutdowns, bandwidth limitations, and international disruptions of electronic communications to suppress marginalized voices? What have you come up with? What have you encountered, and what's your thought on, for folks, people, and organizations that are grappling with this issue? Where do they find the answers to those questions?
Should I pick up on that?
Yeah, I think Abdullah is, because I'm more doing
Yeah.
it from the research perspective. So,
All right.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
that-
Go ahead, Abdullah. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's very good question, and it's not easy to respond. For one, we are facing a state actor in many cases with a huge resources. They control the terrain, they control the broadband networks. So if they block you, like as mentioned, our colleagues from Canada, like Iranian example, they completely shut down the internet networks, not just the targeted website. So they can simply, turn off the, grid for you. So you can only do certain things at the personal level with some recommendation from NGO who are specialized on these kind of things. You don't rely on one outlet. Like, you have your own website, so you can keep your content there active. It may be hacked, it may be targeted, but you can, put it up again very quickly. You don't rely on just one social media platform like X. They can cave in the pressure as they did in many cases in Turkey. So they block so many journals' accounts. They are not accessible for the Turkish readers. So you go to other social platforms. You base your operation on YouTube, Facebook, Telegram. So you diversify, like you're investing money in a stock market. So I mean, those kind of things you can do. There are some electronic communication channel you can use to securely access to the sources for the information or the audience to disseminate the information. So there are some tools, but not easy. It's quite a challenging, because as I mentioned earlier, I mean, we are facing an autocratic state with a huge resources at their disposal, so they can rain down a lot of countermeasures to block you, to just wipe out your content from the internet. So it's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah. So thank you, Abdullah. And I want to come perhaps back to that. We have a couple of questions from our participants and viewers and folks that are observing that are super important to get to. Dr. Nord, I want to ask you another question, though, since your research is your thing. Why do you believe we're seeing this rise in autocracies right now? And obviously they're impacting journalism, but what's your research telling you about why this rise is happening?
It's a $1 billion question. It's kind of, we wish we knew, because there is no agreement now about like why it's happening. We know a lot more how it's happening. And the reason is kind of why is usually very context specific. It will be a different story in different country. Sometimes it will be a rise in inequalities or dissatisfaction with migration that fuels this dissatisfaction with democracy, and this is how populist leaders come to power. So sometimes it's some security concerns, sometimes it's just some kind of something is happening in the society that like there is this growing trend that democracies do not deliver. This is what like population picks up, and then someone as a populist leader comes to power with this idea that I am your solution to the problem, like Trump was doing, like let's make America great again, like I know how to solve all the problems that are happening here. But the moment these leaders come to power, they become the cause, the reason of this autocratization. So they are the ones that are dismantling democracy. And this is very different from what we saw during the 20th century. And this is something that we saw happening in so many countries, starting with Erdogan in Turkey and Orban in Hungary, and now in the United States also. And also we know something about the sequence of autocratization and how it happens. And we know that it usually starts with attacks on freedom of expression and freedom of the media. Because if you think about it, as this is like the fundamental thing for democracy, because if you don't have a truth about what's happening, if you vote on a lie, this is how democracy dies. So this is why we know in terms of sequence that media freedom and attacks on freedom of expression usually comes first. Attacks on civil society follow, And only after that start attacks on different other institutions, what we call horizontal accountability, attempts to undermine accountability to other state institutions and checks and balances, and attacks on elections. They usually come later. So that's why we see, and it's also something what I showed also in terms of data, that's the data showing that freedom of expression, freedom of the media attacked in a lot more countries than countries where democracy is undermined, because these are the countries where democracy is now at risk, even if they are not yet declining in terms of democracy. So it's the first warning signal.
Okay. Dr. Nord, thank you, Marina. I want to get to some other participant questions. We've got one from Bikwet Sise, which I'm going to read, and may have to do some translation here in terms of the intent of the question. Bikwet says, all over the world, governments are the biggest enemy of press freedom. I think it's unavoidable. And Bikwet says, here in Ethiopia, press freedom is almost none. There is none, practically speaking. Censorship, Bikwet says, is everywhere. Many journalists are in jail because of the current civil war. How can we improve our situation? That's a general question for the whole panel. And anybody can start. Please go ahead.
Say a few things about that. That's a very good question, and something that there's so much context in all of the state of the world and press freedom and what's happening with democracies. But one of the things that I did not mention that I can now is that there are parts of the world, and we didn't even discuss like a few African countries where things are really, really difficult. Uganda, Somalia, even the more democratic countries you would imagine, like South Africa, you would think, but there's a sense of censorship that kind of removes our ability to even calculate and monitor and detect the challenges that are taking place. So when there is a point that comes after censorship becomes so tough in parts of the world, as this question proposes as well, is when you cannot produce any data anymore to calculate the censorship, because it is accepted, because it has become a norm, and it becomes part of the ecosystem so much that self-censorship becomes the norm. So you do not get arrests, and you do not get opposition leaders stand up, for example, to run for elections, all kinds of things and all kinds of ways that democracy crumbles and media freedoms crumble. So journalists who still work in this environment, I really appreciate if this the question is asked by a journalist, thank you for doing what you do, because in that environment, it is even more difficult to be a journalist, because you have no support. And you often don't have the opportunity to report the things that you are witnessing. So in that environment, it becomes so now what can you do? I think what we learned, this is true for a lot of countries. It's true for Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. I mean, I can name so many, El Salvador, parts of Africa. What you can do is essentially in that environment, it's not possible for civil society organizations to work as well. A, there's no funding. B, they're threatened as well. A lot of them are shut down. So a lot of those civil society organizations now in this part of the 21st century, after the 2011, we saw a decline of a lot of civil society organizations moving out, going in exile, activists going in exile, etc. So what do you do in that environment? The only thing we found that can be done is international support, that you need support from organizations that are international, that can help do that work or help maintain some semblance in those parts of the world and in those countries where you have that intensity of censorship. And you can have international organizations that work with in democratic countries. I think it is a responsibility for democratic countries to take action when they see. I think something in Marina's presentation that came up that I've been saying in an organic way, but I think you have data on this that supports that you cannot have a democracy unless you don't think that democracy should exist in every part of the world. I think there was some data that I saw in Marina's presentation that sort of backs that, because democracy cannot exist within one border. Democracy is an idea that is ever present across all borders. And when we see that there's less democracy somewhere else, or democracy is threatened somewhere else, it is going to inevitably impact us as well, and that we as a democracy should speak up. So I think it's a responsibility for European Union and a lot of Western democracies, Australia, Canada, United States, and activists and advocates working in these countries to sort of help support journalism, free press, and democracies in other parts of the world.
You know, that's a perfect segue to Marina. Marina, would you care to pick up on that? That was something of what I was trying to allude to earlier on in my remarks, you know, about freedom. And, you know, if one person's not free, then nobody's free. But Marina, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to pick up when Kiran was speaking, and I find it's also very fascinating in terms of data, is that the self-censorship is on the rise also. That means that like a lot of journalists are terrified to speak up. It's not even because they're already like under pressure, but because the co-enabling environment is so low, you know, that like you are censoring yourself. And in terms of data, a remarkable example that we always bring up is North Korea. If you look, for example, harassment of journalists, in North Korea, it's 0. Similar like in Sweden, but it's not because they are totally free, it's because no one dares to speak up. You know, and if you see number that like harassment of journalists in North Korea somewhere would start to rise, it would be a good sign. It means that someone dares to speak up and criticize the government. So this is the thing that we see now in, for example, in countries like North Korea, and now also Afghanistan and Myanmar, where a situation is so dire that you don't need to censor media because they're already censoring themselves. They know how dangerous it is. And another thing that I also want to pick up with Kiran, because she picked up this idea that everyone, like democracy, has to be global. And this is also true. This is something that we see on the global level now, that the narratives in terms of what democracy is changing, because China is going out like with this discussion that we are also a democracy, just a different way of democracy and doing democracy. So like redefining what democracy is and redefining what media freedom is doesn't help, you know, in this sense. Like if you say that media freedom is only like that you're allowed to speak only what the government allows you to do, then it's not a freedom anymore. So if there is this global narrative that is going around in terms of like that democracy needs to be redefined, then of course it affects all countries in the world, and also countries that like where it has become like so difficult, so almost impossible to operate. And I wish I knew like those brave journalists that are still able to operate in countries like Afghanistan or Myanmar or somewhere. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marina. You know, this is absolutely happening in the United States at this point. And I think I've never, in the 30 plus years that I've been a journalist, seen so many journalists quaking with fear. You know, this is something new to people here. And a lot of it, I mean, we know the situation with the 60 Minutes thing. We know about the Associated Press situation. We know about the Pentagon situation in terms of how journalists can, you know, who's there. And so what really is interesting is this group of people here today gathered. Many of them are journalists, and they're weighing in about this. This is stuff they deal with every day and have been for many years. This is a new situation for folks in the United States, and it may be an enduring situation. We don't know. As I said, the pendulum of life swings back and forth, and it's going to change. But I do want to bring to your attention a comment from Vipa Oraz to everyone, to all of us. Vipa says, thank you all for your unwavering dedication, and especially for your courageous stance against authoritarian regimes. Your work is not only admirable, but it's truly sacred and deeply meaningful. And with that, Abdullah, I want to go to you for your thoughts about that topic we were just discussing a few minutes ago.
Right.
Please go ahead.
I just want to highlight one point that relates to Marina's presentation. I think she made quite a strong argument, which I can relate from the experience and perhaps provide empirical evidence from the Turkish experience. The autocratization starts with the attack against the critical and independent press. That's how President Erdogan play his game in Turkey. I mean, I remember very vividly. I was in Turkey at the time. It started with the 2013 when a major corruption investigation exposed and incriminated then the Prime Minister Erdogan and later President and his family members. Then he started attacking directly the largest media organization in Turkey, including the one that I used to work. Then they fabricated a criminal case to seize the entire media outlet in 2016, even before this false flag coup attempt. Then, when the media became silent, he started going after the institutions like judiciary, independent judiciary, academic freedom, NGOs, and other organizations. But the first line of the defense that was broken in Turkey was the independent, critical, and perhaps even the opposition media. And after that, it was very difficult for even the opposition political parties, NGOs, or others who can make their cases to the public, because nobody can hear what they have been saying. So I think that's very strong argument that we need to focus. The first and perhaps the most crucial line of the defense for the democracies is the press freedom. If that gets wiped out and destroyed, then it's easy to launch a purge of the public officials going after the universities, academic freedoms, critical thinking, all the others. I think that's the key. I think we need to focus.
Thank you, Abdullah. I want to ask this question, and this is something that I've been thinking about. We're talking a lot about AI today and solutions. How can marginalized voices use AI to contest or even eliminate state-controlled narratives and share critical information? Abdullah, you talked about this a little earlier about some of the options in terms of platforms, et cetera. But how specifically can people harness AI? What's your recommendations on that to anyone on the panel?
Well, for us, as in exile, journalists can use them, to use AI for different purposes. Not only gather the information, but also like copy editing, other expenses that you can cut down using the AI and other tools. But we see increasingly the government using a lot of resources to dump the disinformation, misinformation, half truth to the AI database. So there's a lot of blending in so different kind of misinformation with the facts. So this is a challenge for us. But at the same time, what I've seen from my personal experiences, if you create an exclusive content that nobody has, then you actually put an added value to the AI database system. So that comes on the top of the searches. If somebody else, for example, looking for information you have already written, you have already covered, I think that's the crucial point for us as a journalist to use the AI. I mean, like, good old investigative journalism. You do the hard work, heavy lifting, you get the benefits in the end. But you need to be, exclusive, focus on the exclusivity. You need to create an added value, not just, copy of the paste for the other information that's already been out there on the internet, disseminated. You need to create a new content and perhaps, exclusive content. It's not easy, with a lot of challenges, but the benefits is a huge in terms of the AI results.
Thank you, Abdullah. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? We've got plenty more questions, but if anybody wants to weigh in, go ahead.
I do want to mention AI. I think so. For the two things, I want to mention a little bit about what can be done in terms of security, but because we had done some work on that. and we are working towards it. But one more important thing is that I think in a lot of countries, journalists and activists and politicians who are getting targeted by digital repression or other forms of threat, or being tracked by intelligence agencies, because now in very 72% repressed part of the world, a lot of intelligence agencies don't protect journalists. They actually get in the way of the work. So what do they do? I think they're not very, we are seeing that there's not a lot of information and knowledge on how to use AI, because there's not a lot of training. The resources, AI resources, are very kind of cluttered more in the Western, more resource countries. So journalists who are actually getting targeted, who can use it for their protection, don't have access to it. So I would just suggest that everyone should look into it. It can also be just available online. You can use those resources. You can learn how to use AI technology to protect yourself. A few things I want to mention, ways that journalists, activists can protect themselves, free speech defenders can protect themselves, is first of all, there's an automated threat detection and monitoring that can be used. There are different kinds of websites and tools you can use where you can monitor where the hate speech is coming from, so that you have an idea of the landscape. There's a technology called the natural language processing technology. The NLP models can be used to track disinformation campaigns. Identifying those disinformation campaigns can really guide journalists on how to use their reporting, how to report on things, what not to do, et cetera, et cetera. There are places like Troll Busters and things like that. I'll be happy to share more resources in the chat. Then there's, protection of sources is one of the primary things where journalists also need to have access to. So they can use AI for anonymity and digital fingerprint management. There are different kinds of tools that are also available by AI. There are different softwares that can be used. Globe Leaks is one of them. Tails OS is one of them, that kind of create an AI-driven privacy layers. They can voice masking, pixel blurring. These kind of things are essential in countries where intelligence agencies are monitoring journalists and activists. Then you have a lot of other things like geo-blocking. Obviously, AI can help with investigations on OSINT. I think Bellingcat used that a lot. Early warning systems for on-the-ground safety can be used by AI, sensors, data protection, etc. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And finally, I want to mention that AI technology can also help with mental health monitoring for burnout on PTSD. There are certain tools like VISA and VOBET that are available for journalists that I would really recommend everyone to look into.
Marina, you've told us already a lot research-wise. One of the key things that stuck in my head is the worsening situation in some of these places where voices are being marginalized. I wonder if you could give us a sense of the urgency here. How fast are these scenarios deteriorating where these people are losing the ability to engage in whatever they do because of the autocratic wave, if you will, that appears to be happening? How quickly would you say this is happening? And what's your suggestion for people that may be experiencing this? Is this something that people need to kind of get out today and go make a difference and do something, change? What are your thoughts about the speed with which this is taking place and how to fight back against it?
I think it would be a very relative question, what is fast, right? So kind of globally is autocratization within like 15 years, is it fast enough? From historical perspective, like it's just a small thing, what we know is that it's for most countries, it's a gradual process. Which on the one hand it's a good thing, which means it can be stopped. On the other hand, it's usually too slow for normal people to notice, and to stand up. If you think what was happening in Turkey or in Hungary, it took like many years, and there were many opportunities to stop Erdogan before it became too late. But because it was happening so slowly, it was also harder to notice for people who are not for normal people who are not dealing with this. Where it is happening really fast is again going back to your country, JJ, to the United States. This is where we go against the global trend, so it's the same pattern that we saw happening elsewhere, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Serbia, and many, many other countries, but it's happening like so fast that even from the research perspective, we have like difficulty to catch up. And we did it in the article that was published last week, where we analyzed the first 2 months of the Trump administration, how rapidly it was happening, like in terms of doing the same thing that other autocrats were doing, prominent ones like Erdogan or Orban or Vucic, but at such a rapid speed, that like everyone is taken by the surprise. So it would be a very relative, just to answer your question, it's a very relative thing how fast it happens. It would be very context specific. In the US, it happening very rapidly. In some countries, it's happening slowly. So yeah, but it's something what I think we need to do is to raise awareness, and this is where we need this independent media to raise awareness that this is the same pattern happening globally in every country in the world that is now autocratized, and it's more or less the same pattern. And that means that attacks, if you see attacks on media freedom, if you see attacks on some institutions, other things will follow. With Trump, you already know that if he is attacking all these institutions, starting with media and purges in accountability states, attacks on universities, attacks on elections will follow. It's something that has happened everywhere. So.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. We've got several questions I want to get to before we have to go. We've got about 10 minutes left here. We've got one question. I'm going to do, I guess, let's see. Yeah, I'm going to do two. We've got two questions and a comment. We've got a question from Richmond, and Richmond says, to what extent does press freedom and the rise of online media enhance accountability and transparency in democratic societies, especially in contexts where traditional media is heavily censored or controlled? Do you want to start with that, Kiran or Abdullah?
I could just briefly say one sentence and then give it to Abdullah because he has more personal context. Is if the state of press freedom is equivalent, if you know a little bit of algebra, is equivalent to the state of democracy in a country. The health of a democracy is reflected by the health of media freedoms in a country and what kind of questions journalists can ask. It's directly related. When you see press freedom decline, it just is a symptom of democracy declining.
Okay, Abdullah.
Well, I think from my experience in Turkey, for example, traditional media is pretty much controlled by the government now. It's almost 95% of the media outlets, broadcast, radio, print media is all in the control of the government sector. But the internet allowed us, many journalists like, the ones in exile and the ones that, lost their job in Turkey, they can pick up the internet platforms to raise their voices, to keep working as an independent and critical journalist, to cover the wrongdoings of the government, even from the far. So that's a valuable tool that we have in our disposal, but that's being challenged by the governments as well. As I mentioned earlier, this giant tech companies, they raise a lot of revenue from the advertisement. They don't want to lose that, so they cave into the pressure from the host governments, like in Turkey and other places. They block the content, they block the access to those media platforms operated online. In terms of transparency, it's not easy. We always get this question, for example, at the personal level, I never disclose my funding resources because if I do, then the government starts attacking those funding sources as well. Some of my accounts, for example, the PayPal and other accounts that we used to raise funding, crowdfunding, they have been blocked by those companies based on the financial intelligence data they picked from the Turkish government. The government listed, our names with the pictures under the terrorist names next to the ISIS, Al Qaeda, and other, notorious terrorist organizations. So they sort of corrupted the financial intelligence data that gets distributed across the world. When there are only a handful of companies in the world that pick up this financial intelligence data and they pass it to the banks and the financial institutions. So it's not very easy for them to actually check whether this guy is an investigative journalist or an Al-Qaeda terrorists. So they just, shut down the entire banking and the financial accounts of those journalists or the media outlets living outside of Turkey. So this is an ongoing battle, and they have a lot of, resources they can use, a lot of mechanism they abuse actually, as this corrupting financial intelligence data or disseminating the wanted lists through the Interpol, diffuse mechanism and others, abusing the mutual judicial assistance mechanism, asking for the extradition of the journalists from the far. So there's a lot of challenges, but when it comes to transparency, it's not easy to do. And in my case, I never do it because of these repercussions. Otherwise, the government, they can come, or the intelligence agency, they can come after those sources.
Okay. Thank you, Abdullah. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I've got two things I need to do. We've got a comment question from Gebri Gzariba Tadele Desaline, and this question, I'm going to connect with a final question for all of you to just weigh in on, if you will, before you go in your final remarks here. And this question is, in the digital world, how can we protect ourselves from disinformation and hate speech? I think that has been partially answered, but if you have anything you want to say about that, please do. But the final thing I'll ask you is, engaging in public discourse to inspire people to take action is something we've done a long time, and we do a lot. But in this age of growing authoritarian behavior, and Marina, thank you for your research, which confirmed what I was thinking, inspiration is not enough. So what beyond inspiration can and should be done to continue this work? And I'll start with you. We just need some brief comments from you all before we close this out. Marina?
I think it's important to keep in mind, and that's something that we forget sometimes, is that dictatorships thrive in silence. If we don't speak up, if we don't protect freedom of expression, freedom of the media, then this is how we allow autocratizers, to get to power and to turn our countries into dictatorships. And in terms of how we can protect ourselves, I think it's the most important thing, and this is something that civil society can do in countries that are then the majority of countries still. I think it's creating something that is fact-checking websites and relying on fact-checking, and not given that this rise of disinformation and also in terms of artificial intelligence, this is something that we need to create, and not to take it for granted, like, that's whatever, that it will be done for us. And the other thing is that something that only old school journalism can do, this is reputation. This is something that, like, this fact checking the information that you gets, and that comes from your reputation. This is kind of, you can be trusted, and this is something very hard to create. So it takes, again, like years and years to create. But this is where we rely on this old school journalism with really going and checking everything that you report.
Kiran?
Thank you. I think that my final comments would be a few things, recommendations that I would like to, what individuals can do. I think we are all in a new era where everyone around the world is facing very similar challenges that are repressive to rights of citizens, rights of civilians, and our communities. So every individual should take the responsibility to stay informed and resist disinformation. I think it has become a responsibility for the health of what kind of information we are consuming, because that information will not only determine who we vote for, it will determine the quality of life of every individual. And I think we need to understand as individuals that is completely connected. And the second thing individuals should remember, I think, in this time we are learning is to protect the vulnerable. It sounds like it's very disconnected from, democracy or freedom of expression, but it is very connected, because in countries, in places where, really worse things are happening and we shrug that off, we need to participate and learn how to not shrug, because that is eventually going to happen everywhere else. Because to backtrack the cycle of what's going on, we need to reverse the actions of autocracies and anti-democratic things that are happening around the world. And to journalists in particular, like, there's a lot of things, of course, like fact checking, stay connected, center the margins, report with integrity, protect your sources and protect yourself, etc. But one very important thing is that I think journalism should evolve into a new place where we are not competing, but collaborating. It is super important, not only for the information we're sharing with the public, but also for protecting ourselves.
Thank you, Kiran. Abdullah, please.
Just two quick points. One is, of course, the credibility in our profession is the most valuable commodity we have. We need to protect that at all costs. Otherwise, when we lose that, we lose everything. And the second point, I think the general public doesn't pay much attention, perhaps even doesn't care about the fundamental human rights, like a press freedom and others. We need to come up with an innovative way of thinking and create a theme to that sort of act a conveyor belt for the general public to connect to those fundamental freedoms. If we do not protect them, everybody is going to pay the price in the end. But it becomes too late, as Marina mentioned. In many cases, those autocratization processes function very slowly. So when people realize, things become very late. So we have to come up with a new way of themes to connect to the general public, so they can pay attention to what's going on in terms of attack on the fundamental rights and the freedoms.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. Thank you as well, Marina Nord. And I want to thank you as well, Kiran. We appreciate you, all of you, everything you had to say today. And let me just, as we leave here today, remind us, as we come to the close of this powerful gathering, let us not confuse this for an end, because in reality, this is just the beginning of what we need to do. We've heard some powerful stories and heard some amazing recommendations for what we need to do. But let's leave this panel not just informed, but ignited. And let's do it with purpose and solidarity. And let's use this unshakable moment to deepen our belief that no matter how dark the night is, the pursuit of truth is the light, and it's enough to guide us. Thank you for what you've done. So everybody keep speaking, keep writing, keep fighting, and remember the world is listening to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all panelists for their extraordinary remarks, a very timely discussion. And in closing, I would like to announce that as we embark on the World Press Freedom Day 2025, the Journalists and Writers Foundation launched its 6th annual Media and Journalism webinar, a 5-session series of workshops and panel discussions packed over the course of 2 weeks to inspire, empower, and support young media professionals and human rights defenders looking forward to attain the skills of journalism to echo their work of advocacy by reaching wider audiences. And the themes this year include the role of media literacy and narratives in the age of polarization and misinformation, ethics and strategies of investigative journalism, covering cases from undemocratic regimes, navigating through transnational repression, censorship, and digital attacks, cross-cutting line between journalism and human rights advocacy, and lastly, introducing media and press freedom organizations. Well, please check out this inspiring program and consider applying through the links shared at the description below. Thank you.